So to introduce our last speaker for today, which is Pedro Gardete. Oh, it's for the session, sorry. Thank you. Well, on that note, actually the closing remarks go from 12:15 to 2:30 p.m. so I think we're okay. So before I introduce our last speaker for the day, well, not again for the day, for the session, as Heather corrected me, just want to remind you, so, as we said when I started, that one of the evolving themes of this conference has been about competitive strategy through communication, which is really about integrated marketing communication, and about communication in a world that's changing, that's complex, that's increasingly congested. And as we heard yesterday in the Google talk, one way to deal with these kinds of challenges is to think about context and to think about telling a story and to try and make it meaningful. And I hope in some ways these presentations today have tried to do that. Now, obviously, I don't want to sort of oversell that, truth in advertising, but we are now sort of going to go to the next aspect of this where Pedro is actually going to talk about social effects. So we've looked at different aspects of advertising, but Pedro is going to sort of switch gears and talk about social effects. And in fact, when I was asking Pedro about something interesting about him, he told me something that he really likes to do is play with Legos, and I completely connected with that. So that's, I think, a social connection between him and me. And in fact, I think my wife has always been suspicious that every time I buy a Lego for my younger one, I'm actually buying it for myself, and she may be right. So Pedro told me about his favorite Lego, which is, well, he actually told me two. When I asked him, which is your favorite Lego, he gave me two. One was the Death Star, which I'm familiar with. But the other one was the Volkswagen Camper, which is, I think, what I'm going to do after I finish with today, go and look for that. Okay. So Pedro is going to be talking about social effects in buying behavior, evidence from in-flight purchases.
Thank you very much. All right, good morning. My name is Pedro Gardete. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Stanford University. Just in case you're wondering, assistant professor is not the same as assistant to the professor.
So I'm the former. There isn't still, so I still think we still need the assistant to the assistant professor. We don't have that yet, but I'm working on it. So this is really a big data paper. I was sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. I was teaching. But there's a lot of interest in big data right now. There's a lot of things going on. And this is really a big data paper in the sense that this company is gathering all the data it can, and later it's going to decide what can we do with it, right? And so the first thing I did when I thought about this talk was in big data is go to the Gartner hype cycle. I love this cycle. What they do is basically they categorize different technologies depending on how they think the hype right now is for different technologies. And big data is really up there, at least in 2013. Probably it's descended a little bit. It's just next to consumer 3D printing and gamification. These are the things they say that basically, they're probably very important. There's already some things going on, but we're not totally sure of what's going to happen next, all right? And so after the peak of inflated expectations, you'll get through some disillusionment before you actually see enlightenment, all right? So there's a lot of action going on. And there's two main things that are happening in big data right now. There's two main approaches, all right? So the first one is, let's just collect more data. Just keep calm. What's the answer to the problem? We need more data. If we get more data, if you only had a little more data, we could answer this question. And this is really leveraging a lot of techniques that have been around for quite a while in computer science, and now are really finding their voice in this data. So a lot of very important problems in prediction that are being solved by big data, right? But once you're thinking about causality and thinking about causal effects, you actually want to go for a different approach, which is the second one. Just keep calm. You have, all this data that you have to analyze your problem. Let's just pick a very small portion of it. Let's focus on something that is really valuable, right? And so there, what we're looking for is what is the rich data portion of all this landscape, all right? And so the purpose of this paper is to look at social effects. So, of course, there's advertising effects, and those are very important. But another big part of what consumers take into in terms of information for their decision making is just what the other people are doing, what my neighbors are doing, what the other people I see in the supermarket are doing. Right? And this is really a messy environment. Right? So you go to a supermarket, a random this is a crowded supermarket. But still, there's a lot of things going on. And so if I want to learn about social effects, it's going to be hard to start with, right? There's a lot of things to control for. Definitely one way would be to hire 100 people to populate the supermarket and then get one consumer to get there each time, control for everything else so everyone does the same thing, and track this consumer. Okay, how did this consumer react to this treatment? That's going to be very hard. So what do people do when things get very, very hard? They back off a little bit and they use a different approach, which is lab experiments. These work really well. So the plan there is just have everyone sitting in a room with a computer in front of them, get them exposed to some sort of treatment, some imagery, some sound, and then in a very controlled environment get at causal effects. Right? So this is brilliant. What's the caveat is that we don't know if these effects are externally valid, right? When I'm doing these experiments, of course I'd love to buy this awesome mountain bike by $2,000. When I get to the story may be a little different. Right? So the goal, what I would love to have for this paper is a shopping setting that actually exists where people are sitting down, they can't move much, and they have a screen in front of them in which they can make purchases. Right? And this is the setting. So as you know, more and more as you fly and as companies refurbish their aircraft, we're getting a lot of convenience in terms of flying around. And we get this convenience of having entertainment screens in front of us that we can use to buy whatever you'd like, food items, alcohol, movies, right? And this is really a lab setting, right? People are sitting down, they can't move much, they're basically facing forward, they can go to the restroom, that's okay, and they can make these purchases. And so this is the lab setting, this lab in the sky that I'm going to use to identify social effects in purchases. It's very hard, and there's not a lot of work tying these social effects to actual purchases, and especially when there's multiple products, because the complexity just rises so fast. So this is a nice setting to look into these. More and more, if you look at this 25% block, companies and airlines are really looking at onboard retail as a big source of revenue, right? So this market is expanding, it's not contracting. All right, so what is the data that I have from this airline? Let me skip this slide and describe the data a little bit. So I know for each existing purchase, I know exactly what was bought, where, when, who was the passenger, right? I can track these passengers over time. I know the aircraft, the flight number, where they're going. I know whether a particular seat was taken or not, and that's very important because if a particular seat doesn't make a purchase, I need to know if there was a person there who did not make the purchase or simply the seat was vacant. And I know also something about their reservations. I know whether people are flying together to a large extent. There's a number of things informing me of that. And so when I say big data, this is 2 months of data. So it's not a lot of data. It could be much bigger, but it's still quite a lot. So this is 2,000 flights of this airline. It's a North American airline. 65,000 transactions, 260,000 passengers, all right? So the number I'd like you to remember is the 260,000 passengers, because as I advised you in the beginning, I'm going to start with big data, 260,000 purchases, or passengers, and in the end, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at a few passengers that are really valuable for me, right? So these are the goals of this talk. I'm first going to quantify the social effects. I'm going to understand what are things driving them that are influencing these, right? Then I'm going to look at products and notice that products are really different in terms of their capability of affecting other people's decisions, all right? So, and finally, I'm going to think of what are ways in which that we can use to actually leverage these effects. If they're around, what can we do about them, right? So let me explain what's going on in terms of a picture. Suppose you have these 6 passengers, all right, the full flight, and not much is going on. They take off, everything goes smoothly. Luckily for them, that's fine. And now something happens. This orange passenger decides to buy something. Okay? Whenever that happens, I'm going to say that an experiment just started. What's the experiment that started right now? Well, what's interesting about this event is not the initial purchase by itself, but it's the fact that that middle passenger in the back row can see that activity very well. Right? It's pretty obvious that this guy just bought a movie. Right? Swipe their card and put the headphones on, they're watching a movie. And so I'd like to know the behavior of that person. How does that person get affected by this behavior? Right? But I need a control group. Right? I cannot just say that because the middle person buys, it must have been because the person next to her bought. Right? That would be a little naive. But that's the beauty of this setting as well. There's a perfect, or I would say very good, control passenger for this particular treated passenger, which is a passenger sitting just in front. Why is this a good control passenger? Well, think about it. They're in the same flight, right? So they're bound to be relatively similar. They're going to the same place, coming from the same place. They're just one row apart, right? So, and they're in the same type of seat, right? So if the treated passenger is middle seat, I'm going to pick a control passenger who's also middle seat passenger. And then I'm going to compare simply their behavior. So I'm going to say that the biggest difference between the two, and that's the identifying assumption here, is that this initiator purchase is seen by the treated passenger, but it's harder to see by the control passenger. And from then on, maybe the treated passenger will buy, maybe the control passenger will buy. That's what I want to assess, whether there's a difference in their behavior from then on. So, all right, let me skip this and find you and show you the main effect. So the main effect without social influence, so the baseline probability of buying in this airline is 16%. It goes up by 25% if I see someone next to me buy. It doesn't mean that, so it's coming from a relatively small rate, 16%, so this is a relative increase. And here, I'd like to point out that this is just for people who are flying by themselves. So they don't know the passenger who's sitting next to them. And I do some other sensitivity analysis to ensure that. Now, let me show you what a naive approach would look like. Right? And this is the other extreme. Suppose I just use people who are flying together. Right? What happens with people who are flying together? They're likely to have the same tastes. If my wife is watching a movie, I might as well watch a movie. We may order some food for both of us. Suppose I'd use these people to do this test. What would happen then? This is what would happen if I didn't control for this experiment carefully. I would think that social effects were responsible for 125% lift, all right? Purchase probability is more than doubled. You know, if you see someone next to you buy, you know, this is really a great strategy. Just, you know, have someone buy, you'll double your sales, right? What is going on here? Why are we seeing this expansion effect or this divergence from the first graph? What's happening is that, so it's the usual saying of birds of a feather flock together, right? And so if the passenger next to you is similar to you and she didn't buy, guess what? You're similar to her, you're also not likely to buy. But on the other hand, if the passenger is sitting next to you, similar to you, and she buys, then you're more likely to buy. And so this would be the most naive approach that you could take to measure social effects. That would, you know, the same problems happens in advertising sometimes, right? There's many ways in which you can artificially inflate your estimates, and so that's the beauty of this controlled and treatment approach. So what are things that are influencing social effects? There's a number of factors that I look at. One of them is a little counterintuitive. Suppose there's someone sitting next to me and that person does not make a purchase. Does that affect me not to make a purchase as well? That could happen, right? You know, I'm going on a flight and you know, no one's really making a purchase, and I may think, well, you know, maybe this is not such a good idea to buy things on the plane. Could that happen? And so this is what I do. I, again, look at the data. By the way, I'm sorry. Let me just make a quick point, which is, remember that 260,000 passengers I started with? I forgot to mention the N here is 5,000 passengers. All right. So again, I'm just looking at the variation that is really informative for me. So when I'm trying to think about the absence of purchases. Could it be that someone who doesn't buy and sitting next to me also has a negative effect? Could that happen? What I do here is I compare different passengers here. So a different set of passengers. Here I'm going to look at passengers who fall into these conditions. They're also just one row apart, so they're comparable. They're in the same flight. But one of them does not have a neighbor. Right? So one of them has a neighbor who does not buy. The other one does not have a neighbor. So if you think of an information story, the one in the back may have some information. You know, this person's not buying, maybe this is not so good. And the person in the front does not have information to rely on to make their purchase. So the question is, can there be a difference? Can we see a difference between these two scenarios? And if you compare these two numbers in the first column here, it just means that I don't see, there's really no difference between those two. All right? Which is fine. I mean, I think we could have predicted that you know, if someone next to me doesn't buy, I probably don't care too much about that. Now, what about the number of neighbors? I also do this. So I compare, again, passengers who are treated in control pairs. But one of them sees one more purchase than the other. Right? So in this particular case, both middle passengers bought. And one of the passengers actually, if you go on these flights, and I've flown with this airline a number of times, and I'm always kind of looking at all the angles and see what people can see. You can very easily see what the person diagonally is consuming or watching a movie. Right? Sometimes that's how I watch movies, just go through the diagonal. And so is there an effect of the one passenger seeing one extra purchaser? Right? Does that happen? And that indeed happens. So these numbers are going to change slightly soon, but the result is basically directionally is the same. When you see two people buy, your probability of buying increases more than if you just see one person next to you buy, which makes sense, right? So you get exposed to more people, you get a better chance to notice other purchasers, so you're more likely to purchase. That makes sense. And finally, in retail settings, there's a lot of questions about basket size, right? Do I imitate other people? So if they spend a lot, am I also going to spend a lot, right? If they buy a lot of things, am I also going to buy a lot of things? That doesn't happen. If the initiator, that first purchaser, buys a lot of items or makes a lot of expenditures, the correlation between these number of items and the number of items from the control seat, so the passenger in front, is 0. But so is the correlation with the treated seat, right? So it's not that people really are, you know, someone's binging or buying a lot and suddenly I'm also going to do the same. It seems to be more a little about awareness, just that kind of reminder that, oh, maybe this is a good idea and I'll also get something. So let me now talk about different products. This is a setting where there's many different products being sold. Is there a role for them? What's going on? Are they all the same? So here I've categorized, I have the 3 main categories of products that are being sold in this airline. And in the paper you can find kind of subcategories. So also a lot of these results also happen at subcategory levels. So let me go through this table point by point. So in the columns you'll have, what is it that I've seen? Did I see someone buy food? Did I see someone buy an alcoholic beverage or a movie? Or in this first case, maybe I didn't see anyone buy anything. That's our control passenger, right? That control passenger did not see a lateral purchase. Right? And in the rows, you'll see the market shares of basically food, alcohol, and movies. And also the first row is just not buying anything. So what is happening to the control passenger? If you look at the market shares of the control passengers, 12% buy food, 2% buy alcoholic beverages, and 2% buy movies. And there's a huge share of people that don't buy anything, right? So the converse of the 16%. Now, there's a lot of things going on here. What you have in the next rows are what happens differentially if I see someone buy food, okay? I'm less likely, by 6.4%, to not buy anything. Right? So let me go through these results one at a time. The first one is own effects. Right? So this is the diagonal. What happens if I see someone buy food? Does that increase my probability of buying food? Right? The same types of items. And that's big. Those are the biggest effects. So if I see someone buy a food item, my probability of, or the market share for the treated passengers who saw that food item being bought increases by 6.3%. It's a 50% increase, right? Very high increase. If I see someone buy an alcoholic beverage, the increase is 100%, all right? So it's crazy. So it goes from 2.2 to 4.4. The increase is 2.2. Right? And also a big increase for movies, right? So these products are, you can think about them as own social complements, right? If you see someone buy food, you're also more likely to buy food. It's a huge priming effect, right? Now, there's also other results going on. For example, there are items, and this is what happens at the category level. If you see someone buy a food item, that also has a complementary effect for alcohol, right? So you might just see someone, oh, that's, yeah, sandwich, that's interesting, I'll have a beer. Right, that may happen. And you also have substitution, all right? So it's not all good news for companies. For example, I've already talked to the fact that when people see other people buy alcoholic beverages, there's an own positive effect, but there's negative effects on food and movie items. Right? So I was going to buy a sandwich, but now this person bought a bottle of wine. Maybe I'm not so interested in food after all. Maybe I bought alcohol instead. And finally, there's this tendency to think that all social effects are good, right? Just consider the current hype in terms of social media and etc. So we just need to get the word out. That's not what happens in this case. So it is true in the food and the movie categories that if you see someone buy these, you're less likely to buy nothing, right? So you're more likely to buy something, and that's what these negative signs mean. But there's a positive sign in the alcoholic beverage, which just means that when I see someone buy alcohol, I'm so less likely to buy other items like food and movies that overall my probability of buying anything decreases. So it's actually a market contraction effect, right? It's not market expansion. It's actually contracting the market. Now, of course, this doesn't have margin information. So if your margin on alcohol is huge, this may still be great. So then you can do these sorts of graphs that are classical from retail settings when people were looking at what are products that are substitutes and the complements and bring it to the social setting. So this is the case if you dig into the alcohol category. Here we have three goods. So we have first the non-purchase, and the size of this bubble is basically the market share. So this is all the people that are not buying anything. And then you have here other bubbles like beer, spirits, and wine. And so what does this graph mean? If you take all these effects into account and add them all up, for example, spirits are the ones that take the most effects, most inbound and outbound effects, meaning that they're taking a lot of social influence in, right? When people see someone buy something, they're likely to turn to this category. And also when someone buys this category, they also influence other people in the same way. All right, so we've documented these effects. What shall we do about them? Right? So the first question I'm going to ask is the classical high roller question. Right? So this question is not coming from social effects. It's coming from casinos. Right? So casinos have this problem, which is who should we reward? Right? Actually, Sudhir has some work on exactly that question. Right? Should we reward our best customers? Should we reward our worst customers? Right? Should we reward just those customers in the middle, right, who are on the fence? And the tendency is to reward, and a naive approach, right? It doesn't mean that it's wrong, but the naive starting point is to say we should just compensate those really high rollers, the great customers, right? Sometimes that is motivated by the fact that the company looks at the investments on the high rollers, they look at their performance, and without a control group, they'll think, oh, this is beautiful, right? That's why we're spending so much money on these, because it's really paying off, right? Which is obviously, that would be the most naive approach. And so we need a control group to test this. And so here we don't have high rollers, but we have people who have a high willingness to buy, right? So we have some customers who are willing to buy. And so the question is going to be here, whether we should retarget these customers. Because, again, we might fall into the fallacy of rewarding customers who, we're going to buy anyway, and so we may just be throwing money away. And so what is the experiment here? The experiment becomes a little different. I'm still going to look at the passengers who are in the flight, but I'm going to look at very specific cases where two passengers in adjacent rows buy. So what happened there? Both of these middle passengers are being influenced. It's possible that the window passenger is also being influenced, but I'm going to focus on these. These are more salient, the treatment for them. And now, I'm only going to call this an experiment if there's at least one of these middle passengers buying. Okay? If that happens, I'm going to say there's an experiment here. So what am I interested in? I'm actually interested in the behavior of the first buyers. These buyers already revealed that they have some willingness to buy. Right? These may be high-value targets for us, but we don't know that for sure. And so I'm going to see whether the treatment of this passenger actually affects this other passenger more so than the control passenger. Right? Is that clear? So in network theory, these are called feedback effects. Right? There's an effect, and now it's coming back. Let's measure that feedback effect. I'm sorry. Okay. And so remember the first direct effect, that was 26%. That's pretty high. These feedback effects are even higher. The relative increase was 84%, which means that people who have, in this setting, people who have a high willingness to buy also have a high willingness to be influenced by other people. Right? Finally, another thing you could think about is long-term effects. Right? Maybe we can influence consumers today, and maybe we'll get some carryover. Right? So let's influence them, for example, in their outbound flight, and maybe we'll get them to purchase more in their inbound flight. Right? Isn't that brilliant? Right? So here's what's going on in this. So this is the place where the scarcity of data makes you need a model, right? And that's the first model that comes into play here. It's still not the structural model on steroids, the Schwarzenegger version. Right? And so what am I doing here? I'm checking whether people are buying in their return trip. Right? That's my dependent variable. And I'm checking whether they buy on the return trip depending on a number of things. I'm controlling for example, whether they bought on their outbound trip. So the outbound trip is the first trip, and then the inbound is the return flight. Right? Because it's good to control for that because I just don't want to misattribute effects to just the fact that people like to buy stuff. Right? So I'd like to know whether they bought in the first flight or not. And what I'm interested in is checking whether they bought whether they saw a purchase in the second flight, right? So I'd like to know whether, in the first flight. So this is the most important variable. It means that whether I saw a purchase in the first flight affect whether I buy in the second flight, right? So these are the long-term effects I was talking about. And I also control for whether they see a purchase in this particular flight, and I also had a lot of other controls and some variables that are specific to each particular route and do a lot more things. And so this is more observations than before. As I'm going through column 1 to column 4, I'm making the specification tighter and tighter. I'm controlling for more and more things. Right? So in the beginning, I don't control for much. These are all the variables, and you see a positive effect here. It seems that seeing a purchase in the previous flight affects today's purchase probability by 4.5%, which would be meaningful. But once you add, adding, for example, where the passenger is located, the route, the duration of the flight, capacity usage doesn't really affect much. Once you start adding the variables that are related to the fact that different routes are actually different, so passengers who are flying some routes are different from passengers flying other routes, and especially once you try to make the, I'm not going to go into detail here, but once you make the analysis robust to try to make the inference more and more robust, what you find is, in effect, the inexistence of an effect, or better said, I cannot show that there's an effect there. Right? So these companies were interested in this because they felt that this was a new technology, and maybe just one purchase, one social exposure would get people to get on board, adopt the technology, and from now on we've educated the customer. That does not seem to be what's happening. So I'm going to leave the conclusion slide here, but we have a couple minutes for questions, so I'd like to open it up for questions that you may have. Yes?
So I liked your part about high rollers being good targets. I was wondering if airlines did a better job, so I don't fly business class or first class very often, but if they made consumers at that moment of first impression feel more like a high roller, and you had that perception of getting on the plane of I'm a high roller, and you had that experience, would that increase the propensity to buy, do you think?
I think that's a great question. I wish I had data where I could convince this company to do that. So one of the things this company could do, for example, is look at your purchase history and say, there's potential. There's a lot of potential here. So why don't we send this person an offer? Or better yet, if we know where you're sitting, why don't we get the offers to your neighbors and see how you respond to social influence? That could be one way. The other that you're talking about is more about self-identity and kind of in the moment. So how can you boast that? That is so one would need more behavioral insights to answer that question. I can definitely see it working, yeah. There's a lot of value to intercepting the customer at the moment when that customer is making the decision, right? Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
For the case of food, the control group might be sort of tarnished because they see the food being delivered all day. But that would probably bias your estimates downwards if the control group sees the food being delivered to the. So,
how did you think this was a complicated analysis? Not really, right? It was extremely complicated. Why? Because there's so many biases. No. I know what you mean, and I would have answered the same thing if I was in your place. What's going on is that there's so many possible biases and things going on that just designing this very simple analysis is a lot of work. And this is just one of them, right? So what happens in this airline is that there's no rolling cart. So there's the usual kind of rolling cart that comes with the food. That's not what's going on. People make the purchase, and then someone comes with the food directly to your seat and brings it. But you could still say, well, maybe they're always coming from the same place, right? They could always be coming from the back, for example. So that could influence people in one direction versus another. And so there's a lot of some disclaimers and some discussions of these biases.
The fact that it still holds up in movies, and also I think this might bias against you. So the fact that you still find an effect is
I would say that there's a number of biases. Most of them are going against me. Which is great. This is a good thing, actually, in research terms. And the movies are also good because sometimes airlines stock out physical items. Right? That's it. So it's good to have the movie category just to make sure that that's not. That would be a different bias with the research. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.